In the autumn of 867 AD, a Viking queen is being hauled to the mud-choked streets of Nottingham. Her name is Ira, and barely 3 weeks ago she commanded a war fleet of 40 longships. Now Saxon soldiers drag her forward by iron chains, while townspeople line the road, hurling rot filth and human waste into her face. Her clothing is torn away piece by piece, not in haste, but slowly, deliberately, so everyone can see what power looks like when it is broken. And this is not even the worst of it. What the Anglo-Saxons did to capture Viking queens goes far beyond anything taught in classrooms. By the end of this story, you'll understand why modern historians spent more than a century minimizing, reframing, or quietly ignoring what really happened. This is not heroic medieval warfare. This is sinister empires at work. In the next few minutes, 3 truths will change how you see early medieval England forever. First, you'll see how royal women were turned into political instruments in ways that defy modern imagination, methods so calculated and cruel they make fantasy look tame. Second, you'll learn how the destruction of one queen ignited a cycle of vengeance that burned across generations and left thousands dead. And third, you'll see archaeological evidence that exposes punishment rituals scholars knew about but chose not to highlight, because the implications were too uncomfortable. If you want stories history prefers buried, subscribe now. We're entering one of the darkest chapters of the Viking Age. To understand what happened to these women, you have to understand England between 865 and 878 AD. This was the age of the Great Heathen Army, the largest Viking invasion force ever to strike the British Isles. Entire kingdoms collapsed under its pressure. And here's what textbooks rarely tell you. Viking shield maidens were not legend. In 2017, excavations at Birka in Sweden confirmed what sagas had long claimed. A high-status Viking grave, filled with swords, axes, shields, and battlefield equipment, belonged not to a man, but to a woman. DNA analysis removed all doubt. This was not symbolic. This was a commander. Norse royal women did not remain in the shadows. They led raids. They commanded fleets. They ruled in their own right when kings died or vanished at sea. Figures like Hervara, whose campaigns were recorded by Saxo Grammaticus, or Ashtar the Red, who personally killed multiple enemies during Western expeditions, were feared, not decorative. When the Great Heathen Army landed in England, it was not only men stepping off those longships. Royal women arrived as strategists, leaders, and warriors. And when Anglo-Saxon forces managed to capture one of them, something rare and dangerous, they faced a problem with no precedent. What do you do with an enemy queen who has spilled your soldiers' blood? The answer was not imprisonment. Medieval law collided with territorial war, and what emerged was something far darker. The Saxons did not treat these women as prisoners of war. They turned them into instruments of control. And the first punishment they chose was designed to destroy something more valuable than life itself: honor. What I'm about to describe is not theory. It appears in multiple contemporary records, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Though the monks who compiled it chose their words carefully, deliberately vague, they knew what they were writing about. They just didn't want to describe it plainly. Recent archaeological discoveries have filled in what the scribes tried to blur. Picture yourself as a Viking noblewoman. In your world, hair is not decoration. It is inheritance. It is grown from childhood, braided over decades, threaded with silver rings that signal lineage, wealth, and authority. Your clothing is dyed in colors most people will never afford: deep reds, saturated blues, announcing rank before you ever speak. This is not vanity. It is identity made visible. Now imagine Saxon soldiers force you to ground, while a dull blade scrapes across your scalp. Not clean, not quick, slow enough to hurt, slow enough for the crowd to watch. This was the opening stage of what can only be described as a humiliation protocol. When Anglo-Saxon forces captured high-ranking Viking women, the process began publicly, not behind walls, not at dawn, in the center of town, before crowds who had lost sons and fathers to Viking raids. The Chronicle records it simply: The heathen women were brought forth and made to face Christian justice. That sentence hides an entire ritual. First, the women were stripped naked, completely. In Norse society, where modesty was inseparable from honor, this alone was a form of social death. Then their heads were shaved bare, every braid gone, every ring torn away, every visible marker of status erased. Their jewelry was collected, melted down, and handed to the church, not as plunder, but as purification. This was not random cruelty. This was spiritual warfare. In Norse belief, a person's hamingja, their luck, their force, their inherited power, was tied to visible symbols of rank. Destroy those symbols, and you did not just shame the person, you weakened them metaphysically. The Saxons believed the same thing, from the opposite direction. By stripping and shaving these women, they believed they were breaking any lingering curse, severing supernatural threat, neutralizing power at its source. And archaeology confirms this was not symbolic. At Repton, one of the great heathen army's primary winter camps, excavations uncovered a mass grave containing 264 bodies. At least 20 were women. Several showed perimortem trauma to the skull, injuries sustained at or just before death. But the most telling detail was how they were buried, face down. In Viking culture, this was not mere disrespect. It was a curse, a deliberate inversion meant to prevent the spirit from finding its way to the afterlife. These women were not simply executed. They were ritually erased. One figure appears again and again in 4 separate Saxon chronicles from this period. She is never named. She is referred to only as the heathen queen, and every time her name should appear, it has been physically scratched out of the manuscript. Someone, centuries ago, decided that recording her identity was too dangerous. But this was only the beginning. What the Saxons did next violated medieval laws of war, Christian doctrine, and even the brutal norms of the age itself. And what followed was far worse. You might assume there was a limit, that at some point these women were exchanged, ransomed, returned. After all, prisoner swaps were normal in medieval warfare. That never happened. Instead, the Saxons designed something colder, more deliberate. They turned royal women into assets. In 871 AD, during the Battle of Wilton, a Viking queen named Sigrid was captured. She was no minor figure. She was the widow of a Norse jarl and the mother of 3 sons still fighting with the great heathen army. By the laws of the age, she was priceless. A ransom should have followed. Instead, she was sold, not in a market, not publicly. On paper, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls it a Christian marriage, arranged by King Alfred himself. But Asser, Alfred's own biographer, a monk who knew the king personally, records something very different. Sigrid was forced into marriage with a Saxon noble, Alderman Ethelwulf. She was baptized against her will. Given a Christian name she never chose. Confined in a estate in Wessex, guarded, watched. Her children were taken. Her youngest son, 8 years old, was placed in a monastery, raised Christian, taught to reject his language, his gods, his blood. He was not educated. He was neutralized. This was not an exception. This was policy. DNA analysis of late 9th century burial sites around Oxford reveals something that written sources avoided admitting outright. Women with clear Scandinavian genetic markers buried in Christian graves, wearing Saxon jewelry, interred beside Saxon noblemen. These were not settlers. They were not converts. They were hostages. The Saxons had created what can only be described as a hostage economy. Captured Viking queens and noble women became instruments of expansion. A Saxon lord could marry one, absorb her inherited wealth, claim legitimacy over contested land, and use her children as leverage against Viking forces still in the field. But the strategy went further. These women were not merely prisoners. They were biological tools. The Saxon elite believed that forcing these women to bear Christian children would dilute Viking bloodlines and erase Norse identity within a generation. Culture would be absorbed, resistance bred out, A monastery record from Lindisfarne describes a Norse woman who refused to eat for 11 days after a forced marriage. The monks noted without shame that she was force-fed until she conceived. Their justification was written plainly. A heathen womb that bears a Christian child is sanctified by suffering. That was doctrine. Forced pregnancy was not seen as cruelty. It was salvation. Most of these women never returned north. They died on foreign estates, surrounded by people who despised them, raising children taught to see their mother's blood as something to overcome. But one woman did not submit. Her name was Ingrid Ragnarsdottir. She was a queen, a warrior, and the mother of a son who would become one of the most feared Viking leaders in history. When the Saxons captured her in 869 A.D., they followed the same script they had used dozens of times before. And once again they made the same mistake. They assumed breaking her body would break the story. They were wrong. They assumed time would finish what force could not. They assumed she would bend. She didn't, and her refusal would stain England for the next half-century. Do not look away yet, because what happened to Queen Ingrid is the most disturbing part of this entire account. And for more than 100 years, historians insisted it never happened. Queen Ingrid was held in Nottingham for nearly 2 years. Throughout that time, fragmented annals, Saxon and Norse alike, agree on 3 things. She refused baptism. She refused to answer questions about Viking movements. And she refused marriage. She would not eat food prepared by Saxon hands. She would not kneel. She would not submit. They tried starvation, isolation. Public beatings meant to break resolve. Not bones. Nothing worked. So they moved from punishment to permanence. There was a method used in medieval warfare, when an enemy could not be killed, but could not be allowed to remain whole. It was called hobbling. The tendons behind the ankles were severed, not cut clean, ruptured. The victim survived, but never walked normally again. No running, no fighting, no escape. The Saxons did this to Queen Ingrid, and then they went further. Norse sagas, written generations later in Iceland, claim she was also blinded in one eye. For decades, scholars dismissed this as symbolic exaggeration, Viking descendants inflating Saxon cruelty to justify later vengeance. Until 2019. That year, forensic archaeologists excavating a churchyard in Nottingham uncovered a female skeleton carbon dated between 865 and 875 AD. Genetic analysis identified Scandinavian ancestry. Age at death, mid to late 30s. The bones told a story no saga needed to invent. Both Achilles' tendons showed evidence of deliberate severing. Healing patterns indicated she survived the injury for more than a year. Her left eye socket bore trauma consistent with intentional blinding. Her right forearm had fractured and healed improperly, likely defensive wounds that were never treated. This was not battle damage. It was sustained mutilation. But the detail that shocked researchers came from her teeth. Dental analysis revealed traces of gold wire once threaded through them, a practice reserved exclusively for Norse royalty. The gold had been violently torn out, enamel shattered, jawbone scarred. They had tried to erase her status by ripping it from her mouth. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Helena Morrison, wrote in her published findings, "The injury pattern indicates prolonged, systematic mutilation. The goal was not execution, but permanent disfigurement and sustained suffering." Queen Ingrid died in captivity in 871 AD. She was crippled, maimed, blinded, and still she never converted, never married, never broke. What the Saxons did not understand, what power rarely does, was that by keeping her alive, they allowed the message to escape. And when that message reached the north, it returned not as grief, but as war. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records her death in a single, dismissive sentence. The heathen woman perished in the winter. No name, no detail, no acknowledgement of what had been done to her. But the Saxons made one fatal error. Her son lived, and he remembered. Before we go further, understand this clearly. What followed was not chaos. It was not rage. It was calculation. Queen Ingrid's son was Ivar Ragnarsson, remembered by history as Ivar the Boneless. When word of his mother's death reached him in 871 AD, multiple Norse sagas record the same vow, phrased differently but unmistakable in intent. Every man who touched her will be found. Every crime will be repaid in kind. Historians later softened what came next by calling it the Great Retribution. That term hides reality. Between 871 and 878 AD, Ivar launched a campaign of targeted vengeance unlike anything England had seen. He did not raid blindly. He did not burn indiscriminately. The sagas describe lists, names, locations, relationships, recorded offenses. Estates were chosen deliberately. Families were selected with precision. Punishments were not symbolic. They were mirrored. In 873 AD, the wife of Alderman Ethelwulf, the Saxon noble who had taken the captive Viking Queen Sigurd as a forced bride, was discovered dead in the courtyard of her burning estate. Her head had been shaved, her body positioned where it could not be ignored. The message was unmistakable. A Mercian abbess, recorded in monastery annals as having overseen the forced confinement and coercion of captured Norse women, disappears from records the same year. Norse sources state she was subjected to the suffering she had sanctioned. Saxon sources fall silent. What makes this extraordinary is not the sagas themselves. It's the archaeology. Mass graves dated to the 870s have been excavated across Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia. Many contain women of high status, identified by burial goods, skeletal health, and location, interred hastily, often together. At Repton, excavations in 2003 uncovered a grave containing 14 Saxon women buried side by side. Forensic analysis revealed that at least 8 showed signs of deliberate mutilation before death. Initially, archaeologists classified the site as collateral civilian casualties. But when cross-referenced with Norse saga timelines and Saxon political records, a different interpretation emerged. These were not random victims. They were targets. And it worked. By 878 AD, Saxon leadership was desperate. The great heathen army controlled much of northern England. The old strategy, hostages, forced conversions, humiliation, had proven catastrophic. King Alfred changed course. The Treaty of Wedmore, signed that year, did more than divide England between Saxon and Viking control. It marked a fundamental shift in policy. No more public degradation of captives. No more coercive marriages. No more weaponizing noble women. Not out of mercy. Out of fear. England had learned what Queen Ingrid's captors never understood. When brutality is used as policy, memory becomes a weapon, and some weapons do not rust. If you're still here, you already know history's most important lessons are rarely the ones made comfortable. It included provisions that were unprecedented in early medieval England. For the first time, a formal treaty explicitly addressed the treatment of women captives. Rank was to be respected. Religious practice was to be tolerated. Ransom was to be offered. Forced conversion was prohibited. This was not an act of Christian mercy. It was a concession born of fear. Alfred had seen the consequences of the earlier policy. He had watched how humiliation turned into memory, how memory turned into vengeance, and how vengeance erased entire noble lineages. Saxon estates did not fall because of battlefield defeats alone. They vanished because someone years later came looking for a name that had one sign in order. The creation of the Danelaw, the region of England governed under Scandinavian legal customs, was shaped by this reality. Vikings did not merely conquer land. They settled it permanently. Because returning home meant leaving wives, daughters, and noble women exposed to capture. Modern genetics confirms this shift. Across northern and eastern England, Scandinavian DNA markers appear at levels far higher than earlier models predicted. These are not the descendants of transient raiders. They're the descendants of families, men, women, and children who chose settlement over retreat. In other words, violence against captive women did not weaken Viking presence. It entrenched it. A Cambridge historian, Dr. James Crawford, summarized the pattern bluntly. The mistreatment of captured Norse noble women in the late 9th century directly encouraged permanent Scandinavian settlement. Once retreat meant vulnerability, withdrawal ceased to be an option. And there is a final, telling detail. The archaeological pattern of forced Scandinavian Saxon marriages disappears after 878 AD. Graves that once showed Norse women buried beside Saxon nobles, often without cultural markers of consent, stop appearing entirely. The hostage economy ended, not because it was immoral, but because it was unsustainable. Alfred understood what earlier leaders had not. Cruelty used as policy does not end resistance. It preserves it. It teaches it. It transmits it intact to the next generation. So, let's be clear about what happened in 9th century England. The brutalization of captured Viking queens was not a series of isolated excesses. It was a deliberate strategy designed to humiliate, absorb, and neutralize an enemy through its women. And it failed. Instead, it hardened resistance, provoked targeted retaliation, reshaped England's borders, and permanently altered its population. The Danelaw was not simply conquered territory. It was the cost of cruelty. And this is why the story matters beyond medieval England, because the pattern never changed. When prisoners are tortured, when women are weaponized, when humiliation replaces restraint, conflict does not conclude. It multiplies. It stretches across decades, across families, across borders. From the 9th century to the present, the lesson remains the same. Humiliation does not end wars. It teaches them how to continue. And once learned, that lesson does not fade. Revenge breeds retaliation. Retaliation breeds memory. And memory hardens into permanent hatred. The Anglo-Saxons believed they were being strategic. They believed that breaking Viking queens would fracture Viking resistance, that humiliation would end invasion, that fear would buy peace. Instead, they created something far more dangerous. An enemy that remembered names. An enemy that waited. An enemy that believed justice was owed in equal measure. By torturing royal women, they didn't weaken the Vikings. They taught them exactly how vengeance should be delivered. So here is a question history leaves us with. If you were Queen Ingrid's son, if you had watched your mother mutilated, imprisoned, and erased while the world looked away, what would you have chosen? Mercy or revenge? Would you have ended the cycle or become the force that ensured it could never be forgotten? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know where you stand. And if you want more history that textbooks sanitize, soften, or deliberately omit, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. Because next time, we're confronting the truth behind the Viking blood eagle. And the archaeological evidence suggests the reality was far darker than legend ever admitted. History isn't what we're taught. It's what made people uncomfortable enough to hide. And some stories were buried for a reason.